Shalom, shalom, wonderful friends. It is great to be with you. It is great to be with you. Such an intense time in the world, an intense time in the country, an intense time for the Jewish community for sure. And I'm very happy to be in this healing and learning space together, where we can talk about meaningful ideas that can enhance our lives. So let's start with a poll question before we launch into Jean Piaget on learning. Option one, most children can understand anything if you're patient with them. Option two, there are certain stages and certain ages where children can learn certain ideas. All right, neither of those are perfect. They're very limited, but which of those sounds more right to you? Ah, it has never happened before. 100% agreement. We should just close up this class. There's nothing to discuss if we have nothing to debate. Everyone agrees there are certain stages and certain ages where children can learn certain ideas. Okay, friends, we move on to Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist and genetic epistemologist whose pioneering work in developmental psychology profoundly changed the way we think about children's intellectual growth. Born in 1896 in Switzerland, I don't even know how to pronounce the city, Neuchâtel, I think, Neuchâtel. Piaget showed an early interest in biology and the natural sciences, which influenced his later approach to psychology. As a teenager, Piaget published several studies of mollusks, which would earn him an early reputation as a precocious biologist with promise. I was just like shooting baskets in the basketball, in the backyard as a teenager, and this guy is publishing articles. It was a fascination with understanding nature and the nature of knowledge that pushed Piaget to pursue psychology, specifically the study of children's cognitive development. Piaget's interest in psychology took shape while working at the Alfred Binet laboratory in Paris, where he was tasked with developing standardized intelligence tests for children. Through his work, he became intrigued by the patterns of the wrong answers that children gave. These errors were not random, but showed a consistent pattern of thinking that was different from adults. During his research, Piaget realized that children's cognitive processes were qualitatively different from those of grown adults. This astute observation sparked his sustained interest in studying the mental processes of children, leading to the development of his stage theory of cognitive development. Stages might be obvious today, but it wasn't back then. Piaget's theory is based on the notion that children move through a sequence of stages, each characterized by particular cognitive leaps. These stages are not fluid transitions, but rather are marked by shifts in patterns of thought and the increased awareness of these thoughts within the real world. Piaget believed that all children must pass through these stages in a fixed order, and the development of cognitive skills is dependent upon navigating each stage with success. This thesis offers a structured way to examine the intellectual growth of children while also providing valuable implications for how education systems can be designed to better support this natural progression. The stages are sensory motor period, birth to about 2 years old. The sensory motor period is the foundation of a child's interaction with the world. In this stage, infants and toddlers learn primarily through their senses and actions. Their understanding of the world is rooted in direct physical interactions, such as grasping, touching, and moving objects. The signature aspect of this stage is the development of object permanence, the realization that objects continue to exist even when out of sight. This discovery marks the beginning of abstract thinking as children start to piece together the objects in the world around them. I don't know who enjoys it more, the game of peekaboo, a 1-year-old or adults who find it just hilarious that the child laughs every time that you appear and disappear behind your hands. Stage 2, pre-operational period, roughly ages 2 to 7. As children enter the pre-operational stage, they begin to develop the ability to represent objects and events with symbols, such as words and images. Though there is increased sophistication in approaching the world, their thinking is still dominated by intuition rather than logical reasoning. A key characteristic of this stage is egocentrism, where children have difficulty seeing things from perspectives other than their own. While imaginative play flourishes during this period, children's understanding of cause and effect, time and comparison remains limited. Their reasoning, though expanding, remains concrete and often lacks flexibility. Okay, number 3, concrete operational stage, 7 to 11 years old. The concrete operational stage marks the beginning of operational and logical thought. At this stage, children become capable of performing mental operations, such as categorizing information in a certain way. They develop an understanding of conservation, the idea that quantity remains the same despite changes in shape or appearance. While children in this stage are increasingly able to think logically, their reasoning is still tied to concrete situations. Abstract thinking, such as hypothetical situations, is still difficult for most of them, but their ability to solve problems becomes more sophisticated as they start applying logical rules to physical objects. Stage 4, formal operational stage, ages 12 and up. My daughter at age 11 just skyrocketed. It makes sense why traditionally a bat mitzvah is at 12, while a bar mitzvah is at 13, the idea that girls develop faster than boys in many ways through puberty and in other ways. And that's certainly my experience watching her and her peers, male and female. Although there's a lot to say about gender, especially after executive orders yesterday. Okay, in this final stage, children develop the ability to think abstractly and reason logically without a need for physical objects or situations. Adolescents and adults in this stage engage in hypothetical thinking, allowing them to consider multiple possibilities based on recall and forethought based by testing ideas systematically. It's at this stage where children begin to reflect on moral and ethical issues. For Piaget, this stage represents the pinnacle of cognitive development, as children are now capable of scientific reasoning, critical thinking, and understanding abstract concepts such as justice and equality. Critical aspect of Piaget's cognitive development theory is the progression from concrete to abstract thinking, which plays a key role in shaping educational practices. Piaget said, education for most people means trying to lead the child to resemble the typical adult of his society. But for me, education means making creators. You have to make inventors, innovators, not conformists. So what does this mean? Children start with concrete operations, focusing on tangible objects and direct experiences, and eventually transition to formal operations, where they can handle abstract reasoning in hypothetical situations. This shift is crucial in how subjects are taught. Early early learning should be grounded in concrete experiences with hands-on activities and visual aids, while older students are able to explore complex ideas like theoretical mathematics or philosophical debates. Ignoring these developmental stages by pushing abstract concepts too early can lead to confusion and disengagement, while embracing them ensures that children build a solid foundation for future learning. On this thought, Piaget wrote that the child is a realist in the sense that he believes that everything he knows has an objective existence outside of him. What does he mean here? Young children often struggle to differentiate between their internal thoughts or subjective experiences and the external world. In Piaget's view, children are realists because they assume that their mental representations are directly connected to an external reality. For example, a child might believe that their thoughts or feelings can influence the world around them, or they might not fully grasp the distinction between what exists inside their mind versus what exists outside in the physical world. Thus, by respecting the stages of development, educators can tailor instruction to a child's cognitive readiness, fostering a more effective and engaging learning environment that encourages active, meaningful understanding aligned with their current abilities. I don't know about you, but when I was 5, I would go open my closet at night, convinced someone or something was in the closet. My thought made it real, even though there was no reason to believe someone was in the closet. Piaget noted that knowledge is a system of transformations that become progressively adequate. So then, when considering adult development, it's important to distinguish it from child development, as adults experience growth differently. Consider that Piaget's stages primarily address childhood, where the brain undergoes rapid and fundamental changes. In adults, development is gradual and influenced by life experiences and self-reflection gained through learning, academic or otherwise. Still, Piaget's influence extends to adult education, particularly in recognizing that adults also benefit from learning environments that engage their current cognitive abilities. Adult development often focuses on building more nuanced, abstract reasoning and moral judgments, which brings Piaget's work into conservation with other theorists like Lawrence Kohlberg, who we spent a whole session on. For many years, perhaps centuries, educators and religious leaders approached moral instruction as a one-size-fits-all endeavor, assuming that moral lessons could be taught to children of varying ages using the same methods and content. You teach moral reasoning to a 5-year-old the same as a 12-year-old, as an 18-year-old. Lessons about right and wrong, fair-mindedness, and ethical behavior were often presented in identical ways to young children, older children, and adolescents, without regard for unique developmental stages. Kohlberg challenged this approach by suggesting that younger children, still in the early stages of cognitive development, could not fully grasp the complex, abstract nature of moral principles in the same way that older children or adolescents could. For example, a 4-year-old may view good behavior simply as behavior that avoids punishment, while a 12-year-old is capable of understanding that being good might involve upholding principles of fairness, even in situations where there is no clear reward or consequence. The concept of intellectual, moral, and spiritual development is fundamental in Jewish thought, playing a crucial role in both personal development, personal growth, and the continuity of the Jewish people. This is particularly evident in Pirkei Avot, which is explicit in outlining the stages of Jewish learning and life, offering a developmental roadmap for how people should engage with different types of knowledge and responsibilities at various stages. Indeed, each stage outlined in Pirkei Avot aligns with cognitive, emotional, and social developments that work in harmony with Piaget's theory of stages, where intellectual and moral capabilities evolve over time. Just as Piaget emphasized age-appropriate education, Pirkei Avot and the broader Jewish wisdom tradition underscores the importance of developmental stages in spiritual and moral growth, suggesting that different types of learning and responsibilities are suited to different phases of life. Here's what it teaches. He used to say, at 5 years of age, the study of scripture. Scripture means Tanakh. At 10, the study of Mishnah. That is the first part of the Talmud. At 13, subject to the commandments. At 15, the study of Talmud. That means the Gemara, the second part of the Talmud after Mishnah. At 18, the bridal canopy. Those who were getting married at 18 back in the day or earlier. At 20, actually, it's interesting that they waited till 18, given how big of a push there was in ancient societies to go earlier. At 20, for pursuit of a livelihood. Also interesting that many societies push their kids to be farmers at age 8 or 11, and here they're saying 20. At 30, the peak of strength. At 40, wisdom. At 50, able to give counsel. Okay, that's optimistic so far. Now here we get a little bit of a more negative view on age. At 60, old age. At 70, fullness of years. Okay. At 80, the age of strength. Okay, getting a little more positive here. At 90, a bent body. At 100, as good as dead and gone completely out of the world. Of course, they want to give the blessing to 120. But we can unpack what we think they might have meant in some of these and how many of them we think may still be accurate or less accurate. The quoted verse attributed to Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema presents a systemic approach to both education and life, emphasizing the importance of sequential learning and personal development. This ordered progression provides an intellectual and moral framework for life, beginning with the study of Torah at age 5, when a child's mind is most open to absorbing fundamental lessons. At this early stage, the focus is on the literal reading of the text, teaching children the foundational stories and commandments that form the base of Jewish identity and ethics. At age 10, introduction of the Mishnah, the oral tradition, signals a shift towards more complex, practical applications of Torah knowledge. At this age, children are ready to begin engaging with laws and interpretations, hermeneutics, moving beyond the literal text to explore the Jewish teachings and their applications to everyday life. This stage marks the beginning of their ability to grapple with legal and ethical questions, which will continue to evolve as they mature. By age 13, when boys undergo bar mitzvah and girls undergo their bat mitzvah according to more liberal approaches and become subject to mitzvot, the focus shifts towards responsibility and autonomy. This marks a notable developmental milestone where the child transitions into adulthood with the Jewish community now fully accountable for their actions and observance of mitzvot. This stage also reflects the budding development of moral reasoning as young people start to internalize the tradition and the ethics as guiding principles for their own behavior. At 15, the study of Talmud begins, introducing the learner to the dialectical method of holding multiple viewpoints in tension. As the Talmud is rich with debate, differing interpretations, and unresolved questions, training the adolescent mind to embrace complexity, ambiguity, and the rigorous intellectual engagement required to weigh conflicting ideas, fosters a rich capacity for critical thinking and prepares them to navigate the nuanced moral and ethical challenges they will face in adulthood. The developmental lens continues through the life cycle. At 18, the reference to the chuppah, the wedding canopy, signifies a new stage of social development where individuals are expected to develop the empathy and social skills necessary to live in partnership with another person. Marriage is seen as both a moral and spiritual union, requiring emotional maturity and a sense of responsibility toward another's well-being. At 20, which doesn't seem too far from 18, the focus shifts towards the pursuit of livelihood, reflecting the stage in life where individuals begin to contribute to this larger society and take on the responsibility of supporting themselves and their families. Of course, every person is different, but I would love to hear your take on the idea of marriage before career, as opposed to the common perception today, established in career, prior to marital commitment. At 30, a person reaches the peak of their physical strength, ready to take on leadership and more significant responsibilities. By the way, interesting enough, they didn't mention in those milestones having children. I think the assumption is it's 19, right? You're married at 18, at 19, you have the kid, but they didn't name that. By 40, they're expected to attain wisdom, wisdom that comes not just from study, but from life experience. At 50, one is able to give counsel as their accumulated knowledge and experience equip them to guide others. This stage is particularly important in Jewish tradition, where older generations are revered for their ability to mentor and support younger ones. By the way, this is such a rewarding thing to do. If you've never become a formal mentor, it is wonderful to pursue pathways of mentorship. And I think that's one of the great things to establish in our community. Mentorship, whether it's for social entrepreneur, for a young budding entrepreneur, whether it is in Jewish learning, whether it's in many approaches. As the verse continues, it acknowledges the natural process of aging, but even in older age, at 70, 80, and beyond, there's value and purpose, as Jewish thought views the fullness of years as a time of deep reflection and spiritual strength. Stepping back for a moment, let's consider the notion that long before Piaget's theories of cognitive development, Jewish thought had already embraced the concept of stages in intellectual and moral growth. Traditional Jewish texts and teachings suggest that the brain isn't sufficiently developed to grasp complex, abstract concepts until a certain stage of maturity, emphasizing the importance of age-appropriate learning in both intellectual and spiritual growth. In particular, this concept may help explain why the Torah, despite the central theological belief that God is non-corporeal, often describes God in physical terms. The Torah speaks of God's arm or outstretched hand and mentions heavenly clouds, images that convey divine power and presence in concrete, relatable terms. This type of description caters to early developmental stages, when thinking is concrete and where abstract theological concepts, such as the idea of a non-physical transcendent God, would be beyond the grasp of young minds. The Torah begins with these accessible anthropomorphic images to ensure its teachings can be understood by children who are only beginning their intellectual and spiritual journeys, right? I would suggest the Torah speaks in the language of children. And that's why many people think it's foolish, not understanding that idea. But the Talmud is there for adults to really really put every interpretation of the text, flip it, beyond the literal read of its text. Christians typically read text literally, and the Jewish tradition reads none of it literally. But it is intended to make sense to a child who can understand that God is the man in the sky with the beard, right? Rather than mock that idea, we see a value to this notion of an outstretched arm, because the children, according to this intellectual development and spiritual development, can grasp that. By the concretization of the divine in Jewish tradition, discounts the acknowledgement that the Torah is not a literal text. While the Pshat, or most basic read, is suitable for early stages of learning, Jewish interpretation offers multiple layers of meaning. For older, more advanced learners who can engage with abstract ideas, the Torah invites deeper reflection through drash, remez, and sod, more complex interpretations that explore metaphor, allegory, and hidden meanings, respectively. In this fashion, Jewish thought presents a thoughtful, more ancient reflection of Piaget's stages of development, recognizes that one cannot stay glued to the literal level forever. The early stages of learning serve as scaffolding, a pedagogical strategy where foundational knowledge must be fully understood before moving on to more advanced lessons. And just as Piaget reiterated that children cannot grasp certain abstract concepts until they have mastered earlier cognitive milestones, Jewish pedagogy inserts that learners must build their knowledge like ascending steps on a steep cliff. Skipping a step in this intellectual or spiritual journey leads to gaps in understanding that are difficult to recover from, making it harder for someone who falls behind to catch up later in life. Cognitive paradigms. Piaget introduced concepts like assimilation and accommodation, where a child first encounters new information that either fits into their existing framework, that's called assimilation, or forces them to adjust their mental structure to accommodate the new idea, that's called accommodation. This process of learning mirrors the experience of Jewish students who, as they grow older and their intellectual capacity develops, begin to grapple with more complex and potentially conflicting interpretations of Torah. Young children naturally seek equilibrium, preferring ideas that fit easily into what they already know. As children encounter novel, challenging concepts, however, the equilibrium is disrupted, leading to cognitive disequilibrium. In response, the child works to restore balance by integrating these new ideas into their existing understanding, much like a student of Jewish texts who moved from simple, literal interpretations to more nuanced and layered readings as their understanding of esoteric concepts become more and more familiar. This is why we should be gentle as educators, because it is unsettling to have that kind of shift. Piaget's work, particularly his emphasis on disequilibrium and accommodation, lays a foundation for the kind of adversarial argumentation that is a hallmark of Jewish learning, especially in the study of Talmud. As students mature, they are encouraged to engage in vigorous intellectual and philosophical sparring, challenging their own understanding and that of others. This adversarial but still friendly procedural component of Jewish learning pushes learners to give order to new ideas. In the Jewish tradition, debate is seen not as a conflict to be resolved, but as a method of refining one's thought, where holding and weighing conflicting viewpoints leads to a more complete, comprehensive understanding. This process reflects Piaget's notion of accommodation, where the learner adjusts their mental framework to integrate new, sometimes conflicting information. The relevance of Piaget's developmental theory to Jewish learning, especially to the study of Talmud, lies in its focus on intellectual growth through argumentation and the gradual mastery of increasingly complex ideas. The Talmud is a vast collection of legal discussions and debates where holding conflicting opinions is not only accepted but encouraged. This method of study mirrors Piaget's ideas about cognitive development, particularly the processes of assimilation and accommodation. In Jewish learning, the discomfort of encountering new or challenging interpretations is a key part of intellectual growth as students work through disequilibrium to find balance. Piaget's theory suggests that this process helps learners accommodate new ideas into their mental frameworks. And in doing so, they achieve a more comprehensive understanding of both the text and the world. Therefore, the Talmudic heritage doesn't shy away from contradictions. It embraces them as necessary steps towards intellectual and moral refinement. The joy of learning comes from the resolution of these tensions, where conflicting ideas are held together and a more mature understanding is formed. While Piaget emphasized the universality of cognitive stages, Jewish thought reminds us of the uniqueness of each individual's journey. This concept is deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and is echoed by figures like Rambam, Maimonides. He teaches that while there are general principles governing human behavior and development, each person has their own distinct disposition and path for growth. This recognition of individuality adds an important layer to the way Jewish education must be approached. And similar to the idea that Piaget's model must be adapted to account for each child's unique cognitive development, Jewish educators and leaders can also be responsive to the unique life paths of each learner. The interplay between universal developmental stages and individual uniqueness in Jewish thought emphasizes that while we may follow a predictable path in many ways, our personal responses to challenges, learning, and growth will always reflect our singular identity. Piaget's concept of assimilation and accommodation also ties into the Jewish view of learning as an active process shaped by both internal and external stimuli. In Piaget's model, Children do not passively receive information. They interact with their environment, integrating new ideas into their existing knowledge structures or reshaping those structures to accommodate new experiences. This concept resonates with Jewish educational approaches, where learners are encouraged to engage deeply with the world around them, not just with abstract ideas. The Torah and other Jewish texts are not meant to be studied in isolation from life, but are to be lived through interaction to the real world. This external engagement sparks learning, much like Piaget's constructivist approach, which sees knowledge as something that is actively constructed through experience. One critique of Piaget's work, however, is that he overestimated the cognitive abilities of adolescents and underestimated the abilities of infants. In recent studies, it's become clear that infants are capable of far more complex understanding than Piaget originally suggested, particularly in the realms of imagination and play. Play, once thought of as merely recreational, is now recognized as a critical component of learning, even for young children. Through imaginative play, babies and toddlers are not only exploring their environments, but also developing cognitive and social skills that lay the foundation for later intellectual growth. This understanding is particularly relevant to modern Jewish education, where fostering curiosity and imagination can be seen as essential for both intellectual and spiritual development. Piaget's constructivist view that knowledge is actively built rather than passively absorbed is an important insight, both for contemporary educational theory and for Jewish pedagogical traditions. Likewise, education in Jewish thought is not merely about accumulating facts, it's about engaging with ideas, wrestling with contradictions, and actively constructing meaning from one's experiences and studies. Whether through the study of Talmud, immersion in the natural world, or the act of creative play, learners are constantly encountering new stimuli that challenge and expand their understanding. And to move towards a conclusion, Piaget's academic journey, which blended psychology, biology, and philosophy, culminated in his theory of genetic epistemology, the study of the origins of knowledge. He believed that knowledge develops gradually and systematically through biological maturation and interaction with the environment. This idea, central to his stage theory of cognitive development, has added a profound influence not only on psychology, but also on fields like education, philosophy, and even artificial intelligence. Piaget's work emphasized the importance of creating environments that promote active learning, which has shaped modern educational experience and practices. Inquiry-based hands-on learning methods, now common in classrooms, are rooted in his theories. His focus on the stages of development underscored the necessity of age-appropriate education, recognizing that children's cognitive abilities evolve over time, and teaching must be adapted accordingly. But more powerful than regurgitating facts is absorbing powerful lessons that stay with us. On that matter, Piaget allegedly wrote, "Intelligence is what you use when you don't know what to do." In both Piaget's developmental theory and Jewish thought, the journey of intellectual and moral growth is marked by stages that build upon one another, guided by both universal principles and individual uniqueness. Just as Piaget's stages of cognitive development teach us the importance of scaffolding knowledge, Jewish tradition offers a lifelong ladder of learning, beginning with simple, concrete ideas and progressing towards the abstract and profound. Jewish education, like Piaget's model, stresses that learners actively construct knowledge through engagement with the environment. Whether through the Talmudic embrace of argumentation or the developmental framework, both systems emphasize the need to accommodate new ideas and adapt intellectually over time. Piaget and the Jewish tradition together demonstrate that learning is not a static act, but a continuous process of growth, shaping both the intellect and the soul as learners progress through the wondrous stages of life.
I guess we're down to a very small core group today. I guess the first question I wanted to make sure I understood rather than saying something, is Piaget's theories end with adolescence. Do I understand that correctly? That he talks about the stages of learning until the time one is able
Yes, and
to.
yes, and we are going to come to Keegan soon, who is going to do adult development, which is a
Yeah,
whole other fascinating world that we're going to explore. Yes.
right. So most of the discussion that you had about the Pirkei Avot and the stages deal with development after bar mitzvah
Correct.
of the depth of learning that
Yes.
occurs as an adult. And so at least when I was listening, I was understanding them as in the same tradition of stages of development, but
Mhm.
really dealing with once we get to the Jewish stages, where we're exploring the whole panoply, not just child development, but the development of moral and intellectual human beings, as they go through the stages of life, rather than simply becoming well enough conversant to be able to follow the commandments. Am I understanding correctly what you were trying to?
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so glad you moved in that direction, which will prepare us for that adult development section. And I think that like all ancient traditions, there was very little understanding of the development of the mind. Um, and what was actually happening within children. And we're still uncovering layers of discovery there. Um, but but hopefully Piaget's introduction here can continue to enhance our own Jewish understanding of that as well. Yeah, so Ken, thanks for flagging that. Hi, Sarah.
Good morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. So one is Piaget. Some of the gaps are the fact that in writing his work, as I understand it, he really only looked at his own children. He did not study a large gamut of children. He looked at his own and he wrote his books. And they've become the standard while they miss giant swaths of children in their learning. And that's what everyone else has been catching up to do, is to actually dig into that and to change or correct some of his thinking along the way in terms of childhood development. That's number one. Number two, so I was thinking about your suggestion that as we age, and particularly those of us who are in our 70s and older, um, we are respected for our knowledge, which is not quite my experience with younger people. I'm not only invisible, but I'm dismissed because I'm just old. And so while mentorship is great because it begins to perhaps alter a younger person's understanding, that's only if they are out of that incredibly egoistic state that until at least 25, when their prefrontal cortex is supposedly completely developed, they cannot really see or think beyond their own craziness. That's another thing. I love the fact that the Jewish people recognized that there are certain ages, and you asked us to weigh in on marriage before getting a job. Was that 1 or 2 years? So what I was thinking was, well, that may have made sense because there was an encouragement, obviously, to procreate, and we needed to do that in a responsible way. And so after the 1 or 2 years, I'm sure both the young people were ready to get out of the family home, whichever parent they were with, depending on the culture, or the parents were really, like many of us, ready to get the kids out of the house because they'd had enough. So that's my reflection on, go get a job, go find something to do, get out. And your wife can stay home and do all of the cooking and cleaning for me. Thanks.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Yes. Awesome observations, and so much to say on that. Uh, but interesting enough, Freud as well notoriously was hiding under the bed of his grandkids, just watching his own grandkids. And yeah, there were real limitations in how studies were done, and thankfully we have more vigorous approaches now and expansive ones. Um, a question I have for you all is tapping back into your own childhood and teenage years and young adult years. I wonder in what ways you respected older people and in what ways were just too hard to grasp. Like, I remember thinking it was silly how cautious older people were, right? Like, what do you mean I can't do that? Everything will be fine, right? If I do this fun thing, right? And I just thought it was silly that adults thought you should be cautious, when life was about fun. That was kind of one thing for me. Um, I do remember though, thinking older people were silly and boring, but also thinking that older people understood things that I didn't understand. And I wonder if your experience was holding a dual reality as well, both that old people were kind of old fashioned, but also that they were holding stuff that you didn't grasp. And I'd be interested to tap in if anybody wants to go in there in any of your comments. I'd be interested in hearing from you. But David, why don't we go to you next if you want to share?
Yeah, I do remember thinking, parents, grown-ups were gods. They knew everything, they controlled everything. And then as you become a teenager and older, you realize, well, they don't know everything, and boy, they make mistakes. And then, so as a teenager, they're rotten. I know everything. And then when you gain in wisdom, you realize, well, they're doing the best they can, and I'm no smarter than my parents. I can still learn from them. They're still great inspirations. So that is a process of learning. And to Sarah, I do remember studying Piaget, and I think Laurent was was a son, and I remember that. But I also worked as a young person at the lab school at Washington University in St. Louis. And the founder of that was Maya Zook, who either studied with Piaget or she was in some of his schools and testing and learning. And her story is that they always carried index cards in their pockets to write things down because he was a marvelous observer. That's why he could just observe his own kids. That's why he was observing mollusks. He figured this all out just through observation rather than testing, which is unbelievable. So that's my connection, my 7 degrees of connection to Jean Piaget.
Yeah, very, very cool. And it is fun to think of ourselves being social scientists in the sense of, if not empirically, although we should respect the empirical studies, just as you're touching on, David, the ability to really observe people and really observe what people do and think about why they do it, and to do that regularly, just to be curious about people. So yeah, I appreciate that point. Very nice. Anybody else? We have a small group today, so I don't know if anyone wants to jump back in.
Well, I certainly remember watching my grandparents, particularly my mother's mother, who she was so rigid. Mondays we do this, and then Tuesdays we bake, and Wednesdays, like it, and her whole day was, okay, you get up in the morning, you drink hot water, you do your exercises. She was just rigid, and which was, it was good as a child in that I I needed structure, which I didn't have as much
Mhm.
in my own home. And so that piece of it probably was really helpful. But it was so rigid that, of course, I wanted to reject anything that resembled the way grandma did it.
Right.
And she wasn't the warm, loving presence grandma. So,
Mhm.
and older people in general, I mean, I, I did not have a huge extended family. So for me, it was the shul, and everybody there basically was my mishpacha. And was the only kid who was there week after week after week with particularly my dad, but my parents. You know, I came to feel like I belonged to all of them, but I didn't see them as foolish. Like Piaget, I observed them. And I think that's the thing that most sets them apart in my mind is not that I thought they were crazy or stupid or anything else, but just like, oh, you can do it that way. That's interesting. And so mine was kind of a continuous learning process. And yeah, as a teenager, of course, adults are just so stupid. They, yeah, that's the stage. It's like it's the other part of being two. But as you were talking, I also thought about that earliest stage when we have not gotten to the point of concrete thinking and our magical thinking, and how much we carry that with us
Mhm.
as we travel. And
Mhm.
um, and for many people, God is a great example of magical thinking and
Mhm.
how much we cling to that desire for the comfort of our magical thinking. I no longer look in the closet or under the bed. For me, it was also, I thought that monster was hiding in the toilet, particularly at
Mhm.
night when you couldn't see him and he was going to come out and grab me. So there were monsters in all sorts of places. And, but I did have one in my closet also.
Thanks, Sarah. And you know, magical thinking is a great example, actually, of how even if we, on some level, advance in stages, we sometimes cannot let go of that earlier stage. Even if we, on some level, say, "Oh, I don't really believe that," on some deeper level, it is still so comforting to mentally exist within that way of thinking. Um, and that's true for a lot of things in life that our mind seeks comfort and to return back to childhood ways of thinking about many things. Yes, Ken, I think you were going to jump in also.
Yeah, I guess I don't remember my childhood well enough to know what I thought of my parents. I don't recall a time when I ever thought that they were stupid or ridiculous. um, they, they were there were always things that I thought I knew better than them. Like I was a better physicist than my parents. That was what I was interested in when I was a teenager. Um, I didn't blame them for that. I didn't think they were stupid because that was not their interest. There were things that they knew better than me. So that's sort of interesting. And I watched the same thing with my children. I don't think they ever thought we were stupid. They may have hated us at times uh, for the rules we put down, but I don't think they ever thought we were stupid about it. Um, and I see the same thing in my grandchild. He has he's only 7, but he still has great respect for his parents. So, but the questions I had, I guess I had a couple of questions when we were talking about Torah as though it was written for children. It occurred to me that probably the main reason for that, though, was that the Jewish people were like children when the Torah was written, and it was written make a people who hadn't thought about the kinds of moral questions or ethical questions or religious questions or spiritual questions that start to get raised. And so the whole Jewish people was really a child, and it's not until we get to Mishnah and Talmud, periods in which we've gone past the temple period and gone to the rabbi period, where we become an intellectual people. At least that was always my understanding of how we became a people.
I think that's exactly right, Ken. And Maimonides makes that point himself as to why there's things that have to be in the text, because he even makes the point that the generation of Egypt has to die out before. That's why, and Moses die out before they can even enter the land, because you're not ready for sovereignty, the responsibilities of sovereignty. And I think that we're experiencing that as well. I don't mean to denigrate Israelis or anyone else, but the sense of like, it's really hard to mature as a people to come to take on responsibility for having power you've never had before. And I think that we're continuing to have that maturation process. So I think you're right. It's written for children as adolescents and children as a people. I think that's a good point.
And I guess the other question I had, what century was the Pirkei Avot written?
So this is it spans a few centuries, but let's say the first few centuries of the first millennium.
Okay.
So
yeah, I'm just trying to think of what the social fabric was like at that time, that whether people were still living with their parents when they were 20. The Jewish people didn't really have a homeland, because we'd already gone to a diaspora by that century, and so we weren't farmers. I'm sure we weren't able to own land in Persia. So the idea of earning a living separate from your parents, what is perhaps the time you stop being a journeyman and start and go out into the world as a master and actually are doing things on your own. Or because I assume that people were journeymen during that period, from the time they become mature, even if they're not out on their own yet, that they were working, not on the farm, because we didn't have farms. So it's trying to think of the sociology of the time as to why.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. It's beyond my expertise as to what's happening 1800 years ago, 1900 years ago, and livelihood. That's it. But I do want to look into that. I think that's a fascinating question I never thought about.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah. Hey, David.
Such a pleasure to be in a small group.
Yeah, it is.
It's really fascinating. The emphasis on education in the Jewish tradition, how important that is, and the open-ended learning. Questioning's okay at a Seder, asking questions, and it's all for the sake of learning, and a path for the elders. I remember Tevye saying, if I were a rich man, I'd study with the wise men 7 hours every day. That would be the sweetest thing of all. And, now I'm taking Valley Beit Midrash. I'm studying Hebrew. It's not an end, it's a beginning. So I'm glad that you said 80 is an age of strength. Not there yet, but, I'm working my way to that.
Yes. And we will define for ourselves what each of these periods looks like, what we want them to be. Wishing everyone a day of continued learning and strength and good health, and continued optimism during the turmoil in the country, for what we can do together to bring healing to whatever spaces we enter. Have a beautiful day. Thanks for joining.